radar warning tone didn't just beep, it screamed. A hard lock. Not a sweep. Not a scan. A full weapons-grade targeting lock. And it wasn't coming from an enemy. It was coming from an ally. We were deep inside one of the most dangerous maritime choke points on Earth, a narrow corridor of water where turning a warship feels like trying to steer a skyscraper through a hallway. Steel hulls, civilian tankers, and dense shoreline infrastructure boxed us in from every angle. There was no room to maneuver, no room to escape, and suddenly, no room for mistakes. Above us, the sky cracked open. Two high-performance fighters ripped across the horizon, their engines howling past the sound barrier. The shock waves slammed into the deck like invisible hammers, rattling antennas, shaking radar arrays, vibrating through bone. They weren't just flying overhead. They were positioning, hunting angles, testing reactions. On the shoreline, something even worse was unfolding. Missile launch tubes, previously dormant, began to elevate. Slowly, deliberately, like a predator lifting its head before a strike. The system powering them wasn't improvised. It wasn't outdated. It was one of the most advanced surface-to-air defense platforms ever built, capable of tracking dozens of targets simultaneously, capable of locking onto aircraft, ships, even incoming missiles with terrifying precision. And right now, it was locked onto us. Distance from launch point to impact. Seconds. Not minutes. Not even enough time for a second guess. For seconds. That's all it would take for a supersonic anti-ship missile to cross the water and tear into the bridge. To turn a multi-billion-dollar destroyer into burning wreckage before anyone could even process what happened. We weren't just being watched. We were being boxed in. Above, hostile aircraft. Shoreline missile systems. Beside us, civilian vessels limiting movement. And somewhere in that chaos, intent. Because this wasn't random. This was synchronized. Calculated. Engineered. A perfect kill box. The combat systems on board didn't wait for confirmation. They reacted. Immediately. Vertical launch cells began to unlock. Missile hatches cracked open in sequence, exposing rows of interceptors ready to fire in rapid succession. Fire control systems spun up. Tracking algorithms recalculated trajectories. Every sensor on the ship began feeding data into a single conclusion. We were seconds away from combat. Then came the order. Electronic warfare, full activation. No hesitation. No delay. The ship didn't fire first. It attacked the battlefield itself. Invisible waves of electromagnetic energy surged outward, saturating the environment with interference. Frequencies were flooded. Signals distorted. Targeting systems probed. The goal wasn't destruction. It was confusion. On the shore, the missile system reacted instantly. Its tracking screens flickered. Clean data streams turned jagged. Target locks struggled to stabilize. But something felt off. This wasn't a typical engagement, because instead of escalating directly into launch, everything hesitated. For a fraction of a moment. And in modern warfare, a fraction of a moment is everything. Then the physical threat hit. Out of nowhere, a fast-moving naval vessel surged into view. Engines roaring, cutting across the water at full speed. It wasn't maintaining safe distance. It was charging, directly toward us, at a closing speed that made collision almost inevitable. Alarms blared. The helm reversed thrust instantly. Propellers churned violently, tearing the water into foam as the ship fought to bleed speed inside a corridor too narrow for error. The approaching vessel didn't slow, didn't deviate, didn't signal. It passed dangerously close, close enough to see personnel on deck, weapons manned, eyes locked. This wasn't intimidation. This was controlled chaos. A layered pressure test. Air, sea, shore, all converging at once. And above it all, those fighters circling, waiting, watching. To any outsider, it would look like the beginning of a war between allies. But inside the command systems, something deeper was unfolding. Because the data didn't match the aggression, the patterns didn't match intent, and the timing was too perfect. The illusion shattered the moment the network opened. Because that's what this was really about. Not missiles, not ships, not even air dominance. This was about access. The moment that radar locked onto us, it didn't just threaten the ship. It created a legal and tactical window. A justification. Permission to respond, not just physically, but digitally. And that's exactly what happened. Behind the scenes, beneath the noise of engines and alarms, a silent operation began. Code, signals, probes. Not random, precise, targeted, surgical. The electronic warfare systems didn't just jam frequencies. They searched for vulnerabilities. They mapped signal behavior. They identified weaknesses buried deep inside the architecture of the opposing system. And then, they slipped inside. At first, nothing seemed different. On the surface, the missile batteries still tracked. The radar still scanned. Operators still believed they were in control. But inside their systems, something had changed. A foreign presence. Hidden. Quiet. Spreading. The technicians monitoring the system noticed small inconsistencies, minor glitches, delayed responses, distorted returns. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. Meanwhile, the aerial tension exploded. One of the circling fighters broke formation. Dived. Fast. Aggressive. A missile detached from its wing. Not aimed at the ship. Aimed at support aircraft operating nearby. The sky turned into a battlefield in seconds. Countermeasures deployed. Flares erupted like artificial suns, burning hot enough to lure incoming threats away. Engines screamed as pilots pushed limits, maneuvering at the edge of physics. The missile detonated behind its target, close, but not enough. The fight intensified. Another aircraft repositioned. Another launch. This time aimed low, toward the sea. Sea-skimming missiles. Harder to detect. Harder to intercept. The ship's defense system responded instantly. Interceptors launched, blazing through the air at extreme speeds. One target eliminated mid-flight. The second barely avoided impact, slamming into the water in a violent explosion that sent shockwaves across the surface. We were no longer on the edge of conflict. We were inside it. But even as the physical battle escalated, the real war was being won somewhere else. Inside the code. Because the infiltration had reached critical mass. The foreign system, once stable, began to collapse from within. Displays flickered. Interfaces froze. Operators lost control. Then total failure. Screens went dark. And when they came back online, everything was different. The system wasn't theirs anymore. It had been overwritten, hijacked, turned into something else entirely. The radar that once tracked targets now exposed itself, broadcasting its own position. Unprotected. Vulnerable. Every connected system began to fail in sequence. Communication links dropped. Targeting data vanished. Missile guidance systems lost coherence. The entire network, once feared, once dominant, was blind. Completely blind. The aircraft overhead lost coordination. Pilots received conflicting data. Warnings filled their cockpits. They weren't hunting anymore. They were surviving. On the ground, operators scrambled to recover control. But the system fought back. Every attempt to reboot triggered deeper failure. Core functions erased. Access denied. The machine had turned against its owners. And in that moment of total confusion, the final phase began. Small, nearly undetectable reconnaissance units were deployed. Fast, low, silent. With the defense network crippled, they moved freely, crossing into restricted zones. Scanning, recording, collecting. What they found changed everything. Hidden infrastructure, covert logistics, weapon transfers disguised as humanitarian shipments, advanced components moving through channels that should never have existed. Proof. Not speculation. Not theory. Proof. Data streamed back in real time. Coordinates. Serial numbers. Thermal signatures. Enough to expose an entire network of covert operations. And it didn't stop there. Because the compromised system wasn't isolated. It was connected. Linked to other defense grids. Other regions. Other countries. The breach spread. Like a virus. Jumping across networks. Triggering failures far beyond the original battlefield. Systems that believed themselves protected suddenly went dark. Operators staring at screens that no longer responded. Entire defense layers collapsing without a single shot fired. And then, the strike. Precise. Calculated. Devastating. Targets identified moments earlier were engaged. Explosions lit up the horizon. Secondary detonations confirmed what had been hidden. Supply chains destroyed. Launch capabilities erased. Infrastructure reduced to burning debris. Within minutes, it was over. The ships moved forward, out of the choke point, into open water. Behind them, the battlefield fell silent. No more locks. No more warnings. No more threats. Just the aftermath of something far more dangerous than open war. Because no missiles had started it, and no missiles had ended it. This was something else entirely. A war fought in signals, in code, in milliseconds, where control mattered more than firepower, where dominance wasn't about destruction, but about ownership of the battlefield itself. And by the time anyone realized what had truly happened, it was already finished. The systems were compromised, the secrets were exposed, and the force that made it happen was already gone. Only one truth remained in modern warfare. The most powerful weapon isn't the one that explodes. It's the one that takes control before the explosion ever happens. The silence didn't mean safety. It meant transition, because what looked like the end of the confrontation was actually the beginning of something much bigger. The moment the system went dark, every operator on every side understood one thing: control had shifted, and nobody knew exactly who had it. Inside the compromised network, fragments of code were still moving, not randomly, but with intent. They weren't just disrupting systems anymore. They were rewriting them. Every radar pulse that tried to reinitialize was intercepted. Every command input was mirrored, analyzed, and either allowed or silently denied. The system wasn't broken. It was being used. Back on the ship, the Combat Information Center remained locked in full alert. No one relaxed. No one assumed it was over, because experienced crews know the most dangerous moment in any conflict is right after you think you've won. Sensors continued scanning, airspace monitored, surface contacts tracked, and then something unexpected appeared. A signal spike. Weak at first, then stronger, coming from deep within the network they had just taken over. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't hostile. It was hidden. A buried layer of communication that wasn't supposed to activate under normal conditions. A contingency channel, encrypted far beyond standard military protocols. And now, it was awake. The system had been compromised so deeply that it triggered a failsafe, one designed not to defend, but to report, automatically, silently, directly to external command structures, somewhere far beyond the immediate battlefield. That meant one thing: this operation was never isolated. It was part of something larger, much larger. The data stream began to unfold in fragments. Location markers, asset identifiers, transmission routes, and then names, not individuals, not units, entire programs, covert initiatives that had never been publicly acknowledged, chains of coordination linking multiple regions together. The kind of information that doesn't just expose tactics, it exposes strategy. At that exact moment, the stakes changed. This wasn't about surviving an ambush anymore. This was about what to do with what had just been uncovered. Because knowledge like this doesn't stay contained. It escalates. And escalation, in a situation already this volatile, can ignite something far beyond control. Back above the water, the remaining aircraft regrouped. They weren't attacking anymore. They were observing, holding distance, maintaining altitude, because whatever advantage they thought they had was gone. Their systems were unreliable, their targeting compromised, and most importantly, their confidence shattered. Down below, along the shoreline, attempts to reboot the disabled systems became desperate. Manual overrides were initiated, backup power systems engaged, physical resets attempted, but every effort ran into the same wall. The deeper they tried to regain control, the more unstable everything became, because the intrusion wasn't just sitting in one place. It had spread, embedded itself, layer by layer, like roots through soil. Removing it wasn't simple. It meant tearing apart the entire system, and in a live conflict scenario, that wasn't an option. Back on the ship, a decision point approached. The commanding officers weren't just reacting anymore. They were choosing: continue the operation, or disengage, push deeper, or secure what had already been achieved. Because every second spent inside that network increased the reward, but also the risk. And then, as if the situation needed one more twist, it happened. A secondary activation, not from the compromised system. From outside, a new signal entered the battle space. Clean, stable, unaffected, and extremely advanced. It didn't behave like conventional radar. It didn't sweep. It didn't scan. It observed, quietly, precisely, and it was watching everything. Every ship, every aircraft, every signal. This wasn't part of the original engagement. This was a third layer, a third player, one that had been waiting, monitoring, studying the entire conflict from the shadows. And now that both sides had exposed their capabilities, it had revealed itself. Not aggressively, not directly, but unmistakably. The battlefield had just expanded again. What started as a controlled confrontation had turned into a multidimensional standoff involving forces that weren't even visible minutes earlier. Inside the command center, the realization hit fast. Staying longer could mean exposure. Not just tactical exposure, strategic. The kind that shifts global balance. The kind that invites retaliation on a scale far beyond a single encounter. And so, the order was given. Not to attack. Not to escalate. But to disappear. Systems began disengaging from the compromised network. Carefully. Methodically. Like removing a thread from a web without shaking the entire structure. The embedded code didn't vanish completely. Fragments remained, just enough to ensure that recovery wouldn't be immediate, just enough to leave a lasting impact. But the active presence withdrew, one layer at a time. Simultaneously, all outward emissions reduced. Electronic signatures minimized. The ship transitioned from dominant force to silent observer. Above, the aircraft recognized the shift. They didn't pursue. They didn't engage, because they couldn't be sure what was still real and what was still under control. The shoreline systems remained crippled, their operators now working not to fight, but to understand, to analyze what had just happened, because what they experienced wasn't a standard attack. It was something far more unsettling. They hadn't been destroyed. They had been used, and that realization carries a different kind of weight. Slowly, the distance increased. The narrow corridor opened into wider waters. The pressure eased, but the tension didn't disappear, because everyone involved knew this wasn't the end. It was a message, a demonstration, a proof of concept, that modern conflict isn't decided by who fires first, or who fires more. It's decided by who controls the unseen layers, the invisible battlefield.